What's going on? All right. Well, very few of us today. Maybe more people will join us as we get going. A word. Ooh, I should mute this. Or silence this. Okay. Yeah, just a word about the exams. The TAs are helping grade those, and they're grading all the classes together just so it's like fair between the different classes. So those are coming. They are partially graded right now. Just hold on a little bit. It's going to take a little longer than usual because essays are harder than multiple choice to grade. But those are coming. I got your exams, and hopefully everybody felt okay with that. Today we're just going over the functional anatomy of the gastrointestinal system. So a lot of it is going to be stuff that we've seen already in lab. What we won't have seen is, right, cell types and the various fluids those cells are putting into our gastrointestinal system. So it's worth a second look. And hopefully the parts that are familiar will help it not feel like such a wave when we talk about cell types. So let's get started with that. And switch that. Okay, cool. I'll drag these over there. Okay, cool. Okay, so we're talking about the gastrointestinal system. So what we're really talking about is how food gets digested and those nutrients are going to get absorbed into your bloodstream so your body can use them. To do that, we have to, well, what we're going to talk about first are the different tissue layers that we see in the different parts of the GI system. And we're going to talk about the major organs that contribute to the GI system. From an organ level, you should already be familiar with most of these. Okay. But the basic idea of the gastrointestinal system, right, is that when you eat food, like, you can't absorb a whole crouton into your bloodstream or something. So the nutrients that you're consuming as you eat are too big to get into your blood. So you need to break them down. Breaking down those nutrients into a form that you can absorb into the blood is what we mean when we say digestion, that breaking down process. Okay. So we have to digest stuff or break it down before we can absorb it. So it's like small enough to get across a cell layer. And the other thing that your gastrointestinal system is doing as you eat food and as it's breaking stuff down, absorbing stuff, is that basically it moves. So it swooshes food around, swirls it around in order to help break it down and to help get those nutrients in contact with the epithelial layers of the digestive system, of the gastrointestinal system, so that they actually are absorbed. So we're gonna start out by talking about the different parts of the gastrointestinal system, but we're also gonna end up talking about nerves and muscles and that movement as well. Not today though. Today we're just talking about pieces of the GI system and the cells. Should have clearly waited a couple more minutes. Sorry, guys. We're still right at the beginning of the GI system. We're just talking about the different parts. So when we talk about the GI system, we're talking about the path where your food moves. So like the path that food takes from your mouth out your rectum, eventually, your byproducts, right? We also want to think about the glands that produce all the different enzymes that basically help us break down food and manage the changes in like pH that happen as we do the process of digestion. So we're going to talk first about the division, about the GI tract itself, so the actual path of the food. And then we're going to zoom in a little bit on the glands outside the GI tract that produce those important enzymes. Don't know how to silence a landline. Okay, so the GI tract is the tube itself where your food is traveling. It's like 15 feet long if you were to stretch it all out. As we've seen in the abdomen, it's all folded and swirled in on itself, so it does not actually take up 15 linear feet in your body. We've seen the flow, hopefully, as we have gone through anatomy lab. So food is going to go in through your mouth, past your teeth, which are going to be important partially in digestion because they're going to mechanically break up the food as you bite it, as you chew it. Food is then going to go into your pharynx, so that's the tube, basically at the back, at the top of your throat. Then it's going to travel into your esophagus, which is behind your trachea, behind your respiratory system, basically. It's going to travel into your stomach, into your small intestine, to your colon, rectum, and then out the anus. So whatever is left that you don't digest and absorb leaves your body. So actually the inside of your GI tract kind of counts as like an outside space for your body because it's open to the environment at the beginning and at the end of the tube. So, you know, you're not like a certain percentage taco after you eat a ton of tacos. You have to wait till you absorb stuff into your body. Okay, so your accessory glands we'll also talk about. It's going to be things like your pancreas, your salivary glands, even your liver is going to secrete fluids and enzymes that are going to get dumped into the lumen, or that hollow space in the GI tract. They're going to help you digest stuff. Okay. So when we're talking about the GI tract, it's a tube, right? We have our hollow tube. And the wall of that GI tract has certain layers. We're gonna first break it down into 4 layers, and then each of those layers is gonna have kind of like sub-layers. So the wall of the GI tract, the 4 main layers are the mucosa, and we're going from what's touching the food out to like what's touching other stuff in your abdomen. So we're going from the inside of the tube to the outside. So the first thing is going to be your mucosa, which is going to line the lumen or line that inside of the hollow tube. Then we're going to have our submucosa. So that's in purple, I believe, on this image. Yeah, in purple here on this image. The yellow is the mucosa. In purple, we have the submucosa, which is our connective tissue. So we're going to have a bunch of like blood vessels running through here as well. Then we have our muscularis externa. That's the muscly looking part, the pink thick layer on the outside. So your muscularis externa is going to be mainly made up of smooth muscle that's going to help us contract different parts of the GI tract in order to move around the food. And then on the outside, we have another layer of connective tissue called the serosa. So we got mucosa, submucosa, muscularis externa, and serosa. They're all in like concentric rings around our tube. So now we're going to go through each of these layers in a little more detail, starting with the mucosa. So the mucosa, its job really is to separate the inside of the tube, the GI lumen, and all the food that is going through it from the internal environment. And here by internal environment, we mean like from the rest of your cells, from the rest of the stuff in your body. So we're going to start with a layer of cells that are epithelial cells. Remember that epithelial cells basically line every quote unquote outside part of your body. So your skin had epithelia, but your digestive tract does as well. We saw that our nephrons did in our kidney, right? So epithelia just like line lumens. So our epithelial lining here in the mucosa is going to be made up of a couple of different types of cells. We're going to lump them together and call them enterocytes because they have a number of different kind of types with different jobs. But in our mucosa and the mucous membrane, we have these enterocytes, and they have some cells that are specialized for absorption. so taking stuff into the body out of that food. They have some exocrine cells. So an exocrine cell is something that like secretes stuff to the quote unquote outside environment. So exocrine cells in your GI tract are going to push stuff like into the GI tract, like into that lumen in where the food is. So we have exocrine cells that are one of our types of epithelial cells here. And we also have some endocrine cells. So endocrine cells secrete stuff into the bloodstream. Those are also one of our types of enterocytes, one of our types of epithelial cells in our mucosa. Okay, so that's our epithelial lining, and it's not super zoomed in here. You can see my pointer. Okay, so when we're talking about that epithelial lining here, we're really talking about is this thin layer of epithelial cells right here. You can kind of see they're like little kind of hash marks there. So that's our epithelial lining. But also part of mucosa, we have something called the lamina propria. So that's deep to our, yeah, I guess deep is the right word here. There's connective tissue like below the epithelial lining. So that's the actual yellow stuff here, that sort of thick kind of looking layer. That's your lamina propria. It's a connective tissue, so it's right like a bunch of extracellular matrix, not a ton of cells, but it's gonna have some lymph nodules in it. So it's important in your GI tract to like neutralize bacteria that you may have eaten. There are some beneficial bacteria, but you eat all sorts of stuff. So it's important that you have actually immune function in the gastrointestinal tract in order to neutralize anything bad you might have eaten. So those lymph nodules are going to be sort of spread out in the connective tissue of the lamina propria. And then we have a thin layer of smooth muscle called the muscularis mucosae. So this is not the same thing as our big outer layer of muscle outside on, yeah, like our third layer of the GI tract. It's just like a little thin layer in the mucosa, but that's why the outer layer of muscle has to be called the muscularis externa, because the mucosal layer has its like own little layer of muscle here. Okay, so that's our first layer of the GI tract called the mucosa. It has our basically mucous membrane made up of epithelial cells that have different jobs: absorption, exocrine function, endocrine function. It's got a connective tissue layer, our lamina propria, has some immune function there. It's got lymph nodules. That has its own little layer of smooth muscle called the muscularis mucosae. So our next, here we have zoomed in on the lamina propria. Okay, so here are some of the facts about the lamina propria. So this is still part of our mucosa. It's mainly connective tissue, has some small blood vessels, and importantly, lymphatic vessels. There are also some nerves in here, but the really important part that we'd want to think about is that it has lymphoid tissue. So it's got lymph nodules and some sort of like collections of cells called Peyer's patches, which are also basically lymphoid tissue. So this is basically immune function in the GI tract. And here we have zoomed in on the muscularis mucosae. I always get ahead of myself, y'all, sorry. So our mucosa has this thin layer of smooth muscle, has two kinds of fibers in it. I guess I didn't mention that part. Has some that are longitudinal. So like if we have our tube like this and our tract like this, some of them are longitudinal like this, and some of them are circular, so all the way around. And so the muscularis mucosae, this thin layer of smooth muscle right in our mucosa itself, is going to help to mix the food in our lumen of the gastrointestinal tract. So it's going to help out with that function. Okay, now on to our second of our big four layers of the GI tract. We have our submucosa. So the submucosa is a layer of connective tissue, and it's going to be thick, so thicker than the lamina propria. And the importance of the submucosa is really that you can eat food of all kinds of sizes, right? Like it's important that your GI tract is expandable as well as collapsible. So you can have a really collapsed GI tract that you can expand to fit like large lumps of food, or if you have a large meal, it's important that your GI tract can kind of stretch to fit that as it pushes it along. And the submucosa is really what gives it that ability. So this layer of connective tissue makes the GI tract distendable. So distending is just like pushing the shape out, right? Like you're able to kind of push it and it distends. It also gives the GI tract elasticity. So the elasticity also helps it kind of snap back into its collapsed form after you've processed a large meal. Okay, so that's really, all of these layers have multiple jobs, right? But that's the real main job of the submucosa. It's also going to have blood vessels and lymphatic vessels, just like we saw in the lamina propria of the mucosa. These ones are going to be kind of larger because this is another layer out, right? Everything branches as you get further in towards the lumen, which is why everything's smaller as you get in. So these ones are slightly larger than in the mucosal layer. Very importantly about the submucosa also is we have a specific plexus. A plexus is like a network of nerves, and there's an important network of nerves in the submucosa called the submucosal plexus or Meissner's plexus. So a cool thing about your GI tract is actually that it has like, in a way the rest of the body doesn't. It has like its own nervous system that has all its own functions, has different sort of connections, and a bunch of stuff can happen in your GI tract in that nervous system without sending signals to your brain and back. So like stuff gets quote unquote decided at the level of the GI tract. And one half of this basic like almost independent nervous system is in the submucosa. So the submucosal plexus is going to communicate with the rest of this nervous system that we call the enteric nervous system. Enteric means kind of like at the level of the organs themselves. So we'll see that this is an important part of nervous function in the GI tract. Okay, so submucosa letting us change the size of this tube because it makes our GI tract distendable and elastic. And also we got a nervous system in there, and part of that is in the submucosa. Okay. The other part of the enteric nervous system is in the muscularis externa. So now we've stepped out to our third layer, our third like main layer of the GI tract. So this is some more smooth muscle. So we have an inner circular layer, changing the diameter of the GI tract, and an outer longitudinal layer, which is changing like the length. Okay. And as they work together, they can, again, kind of like help us churn food, stuff like that. The part of the nervous system that we have in the muscularis externa is called our myenteric plexus. It's also called Auerbach's plexus. Same thing. So this is just the second part of this nervous system that we have in the GI tract that we'll talk about a little later. Our final layer of the GI tract is the serosa. So it basically has two parts. On the inside, so like touching all these layers that we've just talked about, we have a connective tissue layer. And then on the outside, it has an epithelial tissue layer called the mesothelium. And the mesothelium is continuous with those structures we saw in lab called the mesenteries. So those like, they're really hard to describe, right? So, but like where we saw that there were sort of clear compartments, maybe filled with fat, surrounding all our blood vessels and connecting all the different organs in our abdomen. Those were our mesenteries. And so this outer layer of the gastrointestinal tract, the serosa, this outer layer called the mesothelium, is continuous with those mesenteries, which are themselves continuous with the peritoneum, which is like the slippery layer that lines the whole abdominal cavity, basically. So the outside layer of your GI tract just like kind of merges into everything else that's into the abdomen. Okay. So the organs, the organs that we would consider part of the gastrointestinal tract are your your mouth, your pharynx, your esophagus, your stomach, your small intestine, then your large intestine, so your colon mainly, your rectum, and your anus. So that's the whole tube that we're going through as we digest food and absorb stuff out of that food. Okay. So we're going to go through each of these, and what we want to focus on here is basically like what's happening to the food that's like helping us digest and absorb the nutrients in it. So digestion actually starts in your mouth, just chewing your food, actual mechanical movement of breaking it up with your teeth, which we call mastication, is part of digestion. And that's important for breaking food into smaller particles. Like the process of digestion is just making your food smaller and smaller and smaller. And the first way we do that is we break our food down into bites by chewing it. In the mouth, we also start to actually break down molecules using enzymes as well. And that's really going to be the main kind of focus of the rest of this process. So in the mouth, your saliva, part of the reason you produce it for basically two reasons. One is to make your food nice and slippery so that as it goes down these series of tubes, these series of muscular tubes, and we're squishing everything through like a tube of toothpaste, it would suck if when you eat something like a hard taco shell, it just scraped up the whole inside of your GI tract. So it's important that you make food slippery so that it doesn't basically damage the tract. So saliva partially acts as a lubricant to stop that sort of friction of food on the walls of the GI tract. And the other thing it does is it contains enzymes. So saliva includes an enzyme called salivary amylase. We're specifying salivary because there's amylase in another part of the GI tract as well. But our enzyme amylase digests starch and glycogen, so it starts to actually immediately break up large carbohydrates in your mouth. That's why sometimes you'll eat like a cracker. If you let it sort of like sit under your tongue or on your tongue, all of a sudden it'll start to taste like sweeter and sweeter. That's the amylase working to start to break this down into glucose. And sometimes you can actually taste that sweetness. Okay, so in your mouth, you chewed your food, began digestion. You secreted saliva from your glands in your face, right? We have our parotid gland, our sublingual gland, our submandibular gland. They make saliva. They secrete it into the mouth, start to break down carbohydrates. Then you're going to push that ball of food back into your throat, into the pharynx with your tongue. So you take your tongue, push it back. Now the food's in your pharynx, which we just colloquially call our throat, right? It's a common passageway for air and food. So hopefully you are not trying to breathe and swallow at once. Doesn't work too well. If we have food and we're trying to get food into the body rather than air, from your pharynx, it's going to go down a little ways, and then it's going to hit the level of your epiglottis. So we saw in lab that the epiglottis basically covers, right, the voice box and the trachea to prevent food from getting into it, closes over when food's moving through. So it's going to slide off the epiglottis and into your esophagus. So here we see pharynx. Here, like at the bottom of the level of the tongue, we can see where the epiglottis would be. Now your airways are in front, so your airways are anterior, and the esophagus is going to lie behind, so posterior or dorsal to all those airways that we've talked about before. So that's where your esophagus is going to be. There's actually a sphincter at the top of the esophagus. So sphincter is like a ring of muscle that hold stuff close, block stuff from entering your esophagus in this case, or you can open it to allow food to pass. So that's kind of what you feel yourself actively doing sometimes. Okay. Your esophagus is pretty cool because it's actually a combination of different types of muscle depending on where in the esophagus you're looking. And the top part, the part of the tube, like the first third or so, is skeletal muscle. So that's why you can like actively swallow stuff. What you're doing is contracting your upper third of your esophagus, because skeletal muscle is under voluntary control. So when you actively try to swallow something, that's what you're doing. But the lower 2/3 are smooth muscle. So those are involuntary. So if you've ever taken like really large pill or something and you swallow it, or you think you've swallowed it all the way, but then you can feel it kind of like slowly moving down the rest of your throat, you still have muscle contracting there. It's just smooth muscle. It's taking a little longer. That's where you're feeling it move, is through that lower 2/3 of the esophagus that you can't like actively push stuff through it as well. Okay, so we said that the esophagus has a sphincter at the top. So this upper esophageal sphincter between your pharynx and your esophagus is under voluntary control. It's skeletal muscle, so you can actively decide to let stuff into it or block stuff from moving out of it. There's also a lower esophageal sphincter. So the lower esophageal sphincter is at the bottom of the esophagus, between the esophagus and the stomach. So that part is going to be made of smooth muscle, just like the lower 2/3 of the esophagus. So that one's not under your voluntary control. Its job is basically to stop highly acidic fluids in your stomach from coming back up through your esophagus. I'm sure all of you in your life have vomited at some point, right? Like, it's unpleasant, it burns. Stuff in your stomach is really acidic, and it hurts, right? It damages the esophageal lining if it's there too often or too much. So we have a sphincter that kind of blocks it from bubbling back up. Okay, so our stomach is where food, because we're going to say it gets stored. The stomach is where food starts to pool after you swallow it, and it travels the whole length of the esophagus. The stomach is also really expandable. So your stomach, when it's totally empty, has a volume of about 50 milliliters, but at full volume, it expands to about 1,000 milliliters, right? So it has some structures that allow it to get much bigger, but also to collapse down. The job of your stomach is to continue this digestive process that we started in the mouth. So we're trying to break down our food, and it's going to do that partially by using gastric juices. So our gastric juices are going to be a collection of enzymes and other molecules that help us break down things in our food. And its other job is to sort of slowly release this into the intestine. So you don't usually have like necessarily a huge ball of food traveling as one through your intestines, because your stomach is going to sort of gently kind of clamp and release and let it go bit by bit, so that everything gets kind of like nicely evenly absorbed, kind of lets it spread out and lets the intestines work a little more effectively. Okay, so your stomach has a couple parts. We didn't focus too much on these in lab, but hopefully you saw them. So your stomach is kind of like whatever. It's kind of like curved, right? It's got like kind of a J shape. So your esophagus joins your stomach at a certain point. And then there's like a little bit of the stomach that bumps up higher than the esophagus. That's called the fundus of the stomach. So this part is your fundus. It's really expandable. So it's a good place to store food. The body of your stomach here is that basically just the main part. Whenever we call something the body, it's like the main part. The body of your stomach is going to have something called rugae. So rugae are basically just like lines or folds. So the body of the stomach is going to have a bunch of folds that allow it to collapse and expand. So that's going to affect this sort of ability of the stomach to change sizes. And then as we move into our small intestines, basically, we have a part of the stomach called the antrum. And the antrum is going to be really specialized for contraction, basically. The antrum's job is going to be to kind of squeeze stuff into your small intestine slowly. And so we did look in lab at the pyloric sphincter. That's right, basically before we go into the small intestine. Okay, so your stomach has contractions. A large point of those contractions are to mix the stuff in the stomach. And the stuff that's in the stomach is going to be something called chyme. And chyme is a mixture of the food that you've eaten plus gastric juices. The gastric juices are going to be basically a ton of enzymes that are helping break down this food. Oh, and the stomach folds, I mentioned already, are these things called rugae in the body of the stomach that allow the stomach to expand when you eat a large meal, but then contract back when your stomach is kind of empty. Save that space for, right? Your intestines are also in your abdomen and the food is going somewhere. So you want sort of the stomach to be able to get smaller as the intestines get larger, for example. Okay, so when the stomach expands, those rugae, those folds, you don't see them anymore. And the stomach is going to look kind of smoother, right? Because as you unfold something, you uncrumple it, they kind of flatten. It's basically what that last bullet point is about. Okay. So other than the food, the other part of our chyme, the stuff that we're sending into our small intestine, is our gastric juice. And so our gastric juice is produced by our gastric pits and gastric glands. So if we look in the lining of the stomach, basically, so here we can see this gray arrow coming out from the body of our stomach, and we have this zoomed in image. What we see is that on this yellow surface on top, we have these gastric pits, so these like holes. So these holes lead us into these kind of, these bubbles, right? Like these sort of areas lined with a bunch of different types of cells that are going to be secreting different sorts of things. So if we move from a gastric pit and we move down into a gastric pit, so somewhere in the body of the stomach, so we're now somewhere in the stomach wall, at the top, we're going to have these things called neck cells. And the neck cells are secreting basically a mucus. And the mucus is like protecting the, like your stomach flesh, right? Like the actual organ is covered in the slimy mucus layer because your stomach is going to be super highly acidic and you don't want to damage the actual tissue of the stomach, even though you're holding a highly acidic fluid inside of it. Okay, so those are your neck cells, and I'm sorry, the mucus is on the bottom, but the neck cells are the first thing you would see as you dive down into a gastric pit. And then sort of in the bottom here of this pit, we're gonna see chief cells and parietal cells. And these are secreting enzymes that are helping us digest different things in our food and also maintain that acidic environment of the stomach. So the chief cells, here we see our chief cells are these like yellow ones. So chief cells here and here on the even more zoomed in image. Your chief cells are secreting pepsinogen. And pepsinogen turns into pepsin, which is an enzyme that digests proteins. So your chief cells are important for the digestion of proteins because they're making enzymes that help us digest proteins. Your parietal cells are secreting two things, basically. So your parietal cells are going to be secreting hydrogen ions. So hydrogen ions, remember that the presence of hydrogen is what makes something acidic. So the fact that your parietal cells are secreting a bunch of hydrogen into the stomach makes that stomach environment super acidic. And that acidity of the stomach actually helps like denature proteins and stuff. So it actively kind of helps with the digestive process and breaking stuff down. It also helps kill some bad bacteria. Your parietal cells are also secreting something called intrinsic factor. An intrinsic factor is basically just a thing that you need in order to be able to absorb vitamin B12. So they help with the absorption of some of these nutrients as well. Your stomach also has gastric glands. In the gastric glands, I should say, we also have G cells, which are not pictured on this image. But your G cells are cells that are going to secrete something called gastrin, which is a hormone. Gastrin goes into the bloodstream rather than into the stomach fluid itself. So that's going to help you process. It's going to help your body like know that you're eating food and how hungry you are, stuff like that. So we're going to have various hormonal effects involved with the gastrointestinal system as well. But right now we're not focusing on that part. Okay. We are going to focus in on the acidic environment of the stomach. So your stomach is actually at about a pH of 2, which is super, super low. That's super acidic. This is necessary for activating pepsinogen. So that enzyme that's being secreted into the stomach by your chief cells, it works at a pH of 2. So that's one reason your stomach has to be at a pH of 2. The other reason are that having such a low pH helps us start to already break down those proteins. It denatures them. So it's like unfolding them, starting to break them. And a pH that low makes it difficult for lots of things to survive. So that low pH starts to kill some bacteria. We have this mucosal barrier produced by those neck cells that we looked at. So these neck cells here at the top of our gastric pit create a protective layer made of mucus, and the mucus also contains bicarbonate. So everything in the chyme, so like in the stomach contents, is going to be at a pH of 2, but as that content comes into contact with the stomach wall, it's going to hit this slimy mucosal layer that has bicarbonate that can kind of like buffer that, so that that really acidic pH kind of doesn't touch the actual cells of the organ of the stomach. Okay. From the stomach, we move into the small intestine. So the small intestine, thinner than the large intestine, it's coiled, it's pretty long. It's 8 to 10 feet long. It's the primary site where we're going to be both digesting stuff, so continuing to break it down, and absorbing the nutrients. So your small intestine really is for absorbing food. It has 3 different parts, and the 3 parts have slightly different anatomy. In order, they are the duodenum, jejunum, and the ileum. And you took a look at those in lab, hopefully. So a lot of the digestive stuff is going to happen in the first part of the small intestine. Usually, yeah, your absorption and digestion in the small intestine is really effective, and usually food doesn't have to travel through the whole small intestine before you're basically like done with the process. So fluids are going to get secreted into the duodenum, which is the first part of the small intestine, in order to let us finish digesting and start absorbing our nutrients. So into the duodenum, we have a duct that lets pancreatic juice come in. So pancreatic juice coming from the pancreas, which you remember is kind of like nestled in the curve of the stomach, right? Includes a bunch of digestive enzymes, so helping us break stuff down, and also bicarbonate. The contents of the stomach was super acidic, right? The chyme in the stomach is really acidic, but the contents of your intestines is not. And that's largely because of what's happening here in the duodenum, is we're like neutralizing that acidity as we pass this fluid through the rest of our small intestine and large intestine. We don't want to keep it acidic. That's really the job of the stomach. So pancreatic juice getting squirted into the duodenum has digestive enzymes for breaking stuff down. It also has bicarbonate to bring that pH back up to something like more reasonable. Bile is also entering the duodenum. So the duct that squirts pancreatic juice in kind of combines with a duct coming from your liver and gallbladder, squirts bile into the duodenum. Bile salts, mostly their job is to help you digest fats. Okay. Yeah, so your small intestine is highly efficient at absorbing stuff. Most of the absorption happens in the first 20% of your intestine. Yeah, so you basically have a lot of spillover room in terms of intestinal function. Your intestinal tract is also kind of anatomically arranged to provide a large surface area for absorption, right? So like that's part of why it's good that the small intestine is like thinner than the large intestine. I mean, like has a smaller diameter, right? Like more of the fluid, more of the stuff moving through it is in contact with the walls. And the way you're going to absorb things is with those nutrients, right? Hitting the wall of the intestine and then getting absorbed into the bloodstream. Okay. So the small intestine wall is specialized to increase that surface area where we can absorb stuff. So if you're looking at the small intestine and you're looking at the epithelium lining it, we're going to see that in the mucosa, so we said that the like innermost layer, right, of your GI tract is the mucosa. The mucosa of the small intestine have basically like pits and kind of prongs, super squiggly. So we saw that kind of before in our kidney as well, that when we make the edge of cells, when we make them squigglier, one of the reasons we're doing that is to just increase surface area, which helps us absorb more stuff. So these villi are sort of little prong things. We call them villi. They contain blood vessels and something called a lacteal, which is basically an extension of a lymph duct. It contains these for the purpose of helping you absorb nutrients faster. So you have some arterial blood going into your villi, venous blood coming back, and you also have some of your lymph duct going into it. I want to be clear here. So there's a difference between villi and microvilli. The small intestine has both, right? So the villi are part of the mucosa, and they're actually made up of like many cells, right? Like, so we built this villus out of like a layer of cells. So those villi are increasing the surface area by having like this large layer of cells forming this prong. And then each individual cell in the villus. So here we've zoomed in. Each individual cell in the villus has microvilli on it. And so microvilli are those things that we've talked about before that form a brush border, which also increases the surface area. So we've got like, yeah, like a prong with more little prongs coming off of it. So we've increased the surface area at kind of multiple levels, both at the level of like how our cells are arranged and then also the shape of those cells. Between our villi, we have something called crypts of Lieberkühn. So here we see these pits here. The purpose of these pits is basically to secrete a bunch of bicarbonate-rich fluid. So we're still trying to kind of neutralize that acidity that's coming out of the stomach. So we're going to have a bunch of bicarbonate coming into the crypts of Lieberkühn. This is then going to get absorbed later in the small intestine. So we're secreting it here, and then we're going to kind of take it back later. So here is a full image of what we would be looking at when we're looking at our small intestine. We got our parts, duodenum, jejunum, ileum. We got our layers of the GI tract, like always, mucosa, submucosa, muscularis externa, serosa. The mucosa here has villi, and the cells of the villi have microvilli, increasing surface area for absorption. Okay. The liver is also helping us with absorption. So after stuff gets absorbed in the small intestine, right, it's getting absorbed into your bloodstream. So nutrients are getting absorbed, right, like into this arteriole and this venule, right? And then we have these absorbed nutrients in this vein here. Now, all those veins coming out of your small intestine are basically going to go through the liver. So we have this hepatic portal system, right? Which means that veins coming from your small and large intestine join together into the hepatic portal vein and get funneled through the liver before they go into the rest of the body. And this allows your liver to kind of chip in to the process of digestion and absorption, I guess. It detoxifies a bunch of substances and it processes some of our nutrients. So the hepatic portal system just refers to the shape of these veins, basically. First, to the fact that we have these veins that take our nutrients and that blood to the liver before they go to the general circulation. So some of those nutrients are being absorbed into the liver itself, right? So nutrients are getting absorbed from the small intestine into mesenteric veins. The mesenteric veins go into the hepatic portal vein. The hepatic portal vein goes into the liver. And then this liver is going to be like storing some of those nutrients, detoxifying stuff before it allows stuff to pass into the rest of the circulation. The liver does have its own artery that give the liver fresh blood in order to like basically help it do this and supply oxygen to it. Okay, we will talk a little bit more about the liver at the end of the slide set too. Yeah, so if that was confusing, we are coming back to the liver. Okay, so after we go through the small intestine, we end up in the large intestine. So basically, hopefully, we've digested stuff, we've absorbed stuff, and then we're hitting the large intestine. So we have like whatever is left in our food going into the large intestine. Our large intestine is the cecum, the colon, and the rectum. Has some places where we can slow stuff down if we want to, or open stuff up if we want to. So there's our ileocecal sphincter between our ileum and our cecum. So that's basically the juncture between our small intestine and large intestine. So we can kind of control the flow of material there. And when we're talking about the structure of the large intestine, it doesn't really have, it has longitudinal smooth muscle. So we talked about the GI tract as having like circular rings of smooth muscle as well as longitudinal smooth muscle. The large intestine does have longitudinal smooth muscle, but it's basically just in a band down the center of the large intestine. So there's like less longitudinal smooth muscle here than in other places. So it's just like stuck in this structure called the tinea coli. The main part of the large intestine that we think about is the colon. Has different parts. For the purposes of physiology, we don't really care about the difference between the ascending, transverse, and descending colon. Has a similar function no matter what part we're talking about, which is basically to concentrate the waste products into feces. So when we say concentrate, we're basically like taking down the volume of what you're going to have to pass out at the end of your GI tract. So the amount that you're gonna like poop out as feces, we're gonna try to take back as much water as we can. So that's going to make the ultimate feces smaller, physically smaller, as you dehydrate it and suck water back into your body. And it's gonna be good because it'll conserve water like in your blood. And we spent a lot of time talking about how it's important to control our water balance in order to control things like blood pressure. So most of the water is going to get absorbed in the colon, and it's going to basically store feces until defecation, which is just pooping. So we will pick up with pooping on Wednesday.